Alright, UFC 297 is now in the books, and after a long-awaited return to the great country of Canada, the UFC delivered some fights. Definitely not the most stacked pay-per-view card we've ever seen, but there were some fun matchups in this card, from Arnold Almighty Allen versus the undefeated prospect Movsar Evloev to Sean Strickland's teammate and boxing specialist Chris Curtis getting the decision win over Marc-Andre Barriault, the veteran Neil Magny coming out of absolutely nowhere, getting the TKO victory over Canada's own Mike Malott, to Raquel Pennington, longtime UFC veteran, finally getting to realize her dream of being the UFC bantamweight champion of the world. But of course, the fight that everybody's been waiting for, the rematch between Sean Strickland and Dricus du Plessis after their Vegas classic Brawl in the Crowd. This is one of those fights that when it was initially announced, I don't think anyone really cared about it. Two guys in the UFC roster who I think a lot of people feel like accidentally found their way to the top, from Dricus coming out of absolutely nowhere to stop Robert Whittaker in the second round, to Sean Strickland completely outclassing Israel Adesanya in a fight that played out totally in Adesanya's domain on the feet. Both of these guys are coming off of major victories over some of not just the best fighters in the weight class right now, but a couple all-time greats at middleweight. That being said, both of these guys have had very pedestrian performances earlier in their career against guys who realistically are on a much lower level skill-wise. So this fight was an opportunity for both of these guys to kind of prove that they are in fact legit and they belong at the top of the mountain. I'm curious to see how a lot of other people had this fight going into it. I know the odds were almost even, but I thought this was a fight that was almost impossible to predict. When you think about the way Dricus du Plessis fights, the word that comes to my mind is goofy. The guy is extremely awkward out there, and along with that awkwardness, the guy has serious power in his hands, and the guy's really well-rounded. We saw him basically dominate some of the grappling exchanges against guys like Darren Till and even Derek Brunson, who is a longtime wrestler. And then you compare that to Sean Strickland, who, despite all of the craziness that comes out of his mouth, is one of the most calculated, precise, and measured fighters on the feet in the entire UFC. I figured going into this fight was going to go one of two ways. Dricus is going to be so awkward and so goofy that he's just going to have a wild, big, looping right hand land right on Strickland's chin and put him out. Not all that much different from what Alex Pereira was able to do, just in a much more goofy, awkward fashion. And then I figured if Sean Strickland was going to win, he was probably going to have to outclass Dricus for the entirety of the fight. Dricus, who's not known to have good cardio at all. We've seen him gas out in pretty much all of his fights up until this point, outside of the one against Robert Whittaker. And despite all the promises that were made leading up to this fight of it going to the death, this fight actually did go the entire 5 rounds and was a lot of fun to watch the entire way. Early on, I felt like they traded the first couple rounds. Strickland found opportunities to out-volume Dricus, landing over and over with that jab, getting Dricus' eye to start to swell up, and then Dricus was able to mix it up on the feet with the striking and the wrestling to get Strickland guessing what's going to come, and through that land some major right hands, one of which cut Strickland pretty badly. But as the fight went on, it felt like there were a lot of close rounds in there, but the whole time I was unsure of who won the third round. When it's all said and done, it's one of those fights where you kind of feel like nobody lost or nobody won. Fights like this make the case for more draws sound even more appealing, but when you really look at the letter of the law, I do think it does make sense that Dricus won. Number one scoring criteria is damage, and while Strickland was able to out-volume Dricus, I don't think there's much of a debate about who was able to land the more damaging shots. While this fight may not have been to the death, it definitely was a war, and it was a very fun fight to watch. Probably the best fight on this entire card. So what's next? As I'm recording this, Dana White just finished his post-event press conference, and he had a couple interesting things to say. One reporter asked him about when Adesanya expects to make a return, and if it makes sense for Adesanya to go up against Dricus for his first title defense, to which Dana replied, "You'll see next week." He also, during this press conference, made mention of the fact that Khamzat Chimaev, who has been very public with some of his health issues that he's been facing lately, may potentially not even be healthy enough to be ready to make a return by UFC 300. And whether that's true or not is up for debate, but if that's Dana's thinking, that probably means that he's not in direct negotiations right now to make a fight with Khamzat. But he also mentioned that Dricus, now being the champion, is the kind of fighter that Dana White can book for a main event in South Africa, which leads me to believe that either one of two things is true. Either A, Israel Adesanya is going to be fighting on UFC 300 against Dricus du Plessis. That way, whoever wins is still an African-born fighter who would make perfect sense to host a pay-per-view event in the continent of Africa. Or B, they're saving Dricus for whenever they can actually book an event in Africa. Very interesting. And as for Sean Strickland, I think that his title run that he was able to make coming from absolutely nowhere was able to get him a lot of new fans. And I think that even though he's not the champion, there's no shortage of people that are going to want to watch him fight in the near future. And while I do think Strickland is the kind of guy who makes a lot of sense for a fight night main event, I think he's elevated himself to a level now where Strickland's the kind of guy you want in fun, big name fights. And since Dana White was quick to shut down the idea of an immediate rematch between Sean and Dricus, and since the next up-and-coming contender at middleweight is Jared Cannonier, who Sean fought not that long ago already, I think it might make a lot of sense for Sean Strickland to have a fun fight against Ian Machado Gary, potentially at UFC 300. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do any of these ideas make any sense at all whatsoever? And how do you feel about this fight? Do you agree with the decision? Do you think Sean got robbed? And who do you want to see these guys fight next? Thanks for watching. Peace.